Greetings and salutations to our fine podcast audience. Welcome to 3Ps in a Pod, episode 246.
We made it.
Yes, we are. And those of all us here on this podcast never want to shy away from any question. So we're going to take on what you probably thought would be a very controversial question if you read the graphic before you hit play on this video or this podcast. But
what does it say?
I don't know what it. I can't wait to see what.
I cannot wait to see what it is.
What
Wow.
Most people would call this one of those, hot button topics.
Clickbait. This is our clickbait. You put a really provocative title, and people got to see what are they going to say? Because that's what people want to do. People want to see every issue. They go, what do these three morons?
Yeah, why would
we matter?
That's right.
We don't.
Automatically. I'll let them. No, never mind.
Okay.
I'm gonna let it go.
Probably why.
Yeah, it was.
Filter.
I'm gonna shut that down.
Filter.
My brain was like, "Say it," and I'm like, "No, do not say it."
Say it. Okay. So here's the question. Controversial. Why do Christians seem to put more of an emphasis on sexual sins than others, especially ones involving homosexuality or trans issues? Am I missing something? Should these sins be treated differently, and do they negate anything else Christian about a person?
All right.
So why, guys? Why do Christians put more of an emphasis on those? First of all,
okay, do
they?
I always like to start with the last question.
All right, contrarian.
I know.
So, do you want to just answer the last question?
No, but that's what it may be my ADHD is the only one that I remember.
I just think maybe you're just only remembering the last part of the question.
It's the last thing I said. Yeah. I know.
Go ahead.
I was just, I wanted to start back at the beginning and say
that's the logical place to start.
Because I'm a logical dude.
You are.
Why do Christians seem to put more emphasis on sexual sins than others? And my question was that does presume that they do.
Sure.
Right.
And I would imagine the person asking this question seems to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be their experience.
Mm-hmm.
But do they?
So I can see why a person would say this.
Me too.
Because I do think that there is a large and very vocal section of Christianity.
Yes.
That, and I'll say this, American evangelical Christianity, to get even more,
There you go.
that this seems to be at least the talking point for all issues.
Mm-hmm.
This and maybe like abortion would be the top.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about something that's wrong with our country or wrong with something, there are certainly Christians who seem to make this the...
And do you think that's because most white evangelical Christians, to narrow it down, feel like this is one of those, I feel like they often consider this is like the slam dunk. It's like, I know, you talked about a few weeks ago, having certainty.
Okay,
I feel like a lot of Christians have rallied around these issues because they do feel that large bit of certainty about this topic.
Okay.
And so when they get that, I'm certain about this. This is a all or nothing, black or white issue for me. And so I know if I stand on this side of the issue, I'm going to be in the right. And everybody will know I'm in the right. And maybe even me and God will be better off.
Right.
I'll be better off with God because I'm on his side of this. Do you think that plays into it? I feel like it does.
I think it can. And I think in particular, where I think, unfortunately, and I'll say this, unfortunately, where most people, even within Christianity, but people certainly outside of American Christianity, where they see this play out is mostly the evangelical voting bloc talking about this. And that's what I would say is I think that group tends to be very particularly vocal about this. But I want to say that there are entire groups of Christians that I would say swing to a whole different side of this, which they don't talk about any kind of sexual, and to use the word sin, to say anything really. There are handfuls of things that would be considered sexual sin, but they would float to a whole other end of the spectrum of saying, well, we're not going to talk about it at all.
I'd like to say, unlike abortion, well, I don't know. White evangelicals, I will say this. I just don't want it on this particular issue. Pretty much worldwide, the church is fairly united I mean, honestly.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, the Methodist Church in the United States has had to split from the worldwide Methodist Church because the rest of the world stands where people in our country think only white evangelicals in our country stand. They're very conservative.
You're talking about
it.
on the stance
And Catholicism in general on these issues. Those issues stand where we stand.
You're talking about on the stance of whether these sexual activities are sinful or not. Yeah. The question I think though is,
I mean, historically, this has not been a broadly open question.
No. I agree with that. I think the question is, why has it become such an emphasis that this tends to be?
That's a good question, and it might be the culture has changed.
Maybe.
It could be that it's become, as culture has pushed on this, and I'm just saying worldwide, this is not an American issue.
No.
This is not a Western issue. Christians have stood pretty much on the same place of this for a long, long time.
But that's been historically true on a host of other issues that the church would hold a position that the culture widely at large would disagree with.
Sure.
But I think uniquely maybe not, but I think that the fact that the way that we have talked about it and the way that we have held it has put us more at odds or in animosity with the culture.
I don't disagree with
You know
we
what
have
I mean?
done a terrible job of talking about sin in general.
Yes.
I was reacting more to the idea that it's white evangelical only. This is pretty a universal Christian position.
It is. And I do think the position is, but the question is the emphasis.
Well, I think the emphasis, I'll just say to you, I think being a baby boomer and staying strong on my position that baby boomers have screwed everything up. There's not much that boomers didn't screw up and that everybody else will have to fix. The sexual revolution, that's not my term. That's not it.
Yeah, that's
a term widely known in the culture.
That's right.
That came in and
That's true.
everything began to change.
Yes.
And so it's not just this issue. There's all kinds of issues that surround sexuality
Yes.
that the church universally worldwide, I mean, not just these issues. If you talk to any Christian anywhere in the world outside of Western countries and you try to explain to them the way we talk about divorce,
Sure.
they're like, what?
Yeah.
Because that's not typically where the church in general is. I'm just saying, we have done a terrible job of addressing it to our culture by taking a way of understanding this is a big issue to people in our culture who have not agreed to live by Christian standards.
Well, and I think
that's a big issue for us, that we assume that everybody ought to live by Christian standards. And so therefore we take a power position instead of the position Christ would have us to take a position underneath. And, it really shouldn't matter all that much to people who don't want to follow Jesus, what I think about any of this.
yes, that's correct.
As long as,
I don't have power.
That's right.
As long as I don't have power
over them.
Right.
If we took the proper Christ-like position in the culture,
Right.
this wouldn't be a problem.
Right. And if I took the proper position when I have power and could enforce something on somebody they haven't agreed to, I have violated and become sinful in that moment.
That's right.
So, should these sins be treated differently? No. No. Obviously, that's the answer is no, they should not be treated indifferently. And the last question that I said I wanted to answer first is, does this negate anything else about a person who follows Jesus who is involved in this kind of activity? No. It does not negate that you want to follow Jesus, nor that you can be following him in areas, because there isn't anybody here answering these questions that right now, that if you got to know us well enough, you couldn't point out things that we violate commands of Jesus. Sure. And hopefully, if you brought it to us, we'd be humble enough to deal with that. The fact that that's true about us does not negate our desire to follow Jesus at all. But admittedly, the way we have talked about it, I get why people are offended about the way we have
Yeah, that's
talked
right.
about it.
That's right.
That's right.
Mhm.
Well, and I think that other part, and that's what I was trying to get to, is I think because we have decided that primarily what evangelical Christianity is a voting block, is a political movement. I think this is why this has become the most vocal thing that we end up talking about.
Yeah.
Is because what we've decided is if I've got to get everyone else to live, because all that a voting block is, I mean, this one person Stanley Hauer often says is that democracy is just the way that 51% of the population can force 49% of the population to do whatever they want them to do. And so in this case, if I have 51% of the vote and I can decide everything about your life I don't like anymore, and I've decided I'm going to try and enforce it on you, as you've said, to someone who would say, I'm not even interested in following Jesus. Well, that now causes, as you said, an animosity between, and then I have to dig my heels in on the point I want to make, and you've got to dig your heels in on the point you want to make, and now we're not even
Now
talking.
we're stuck.
Well, and I would also like to point out to everybody who is the voting block thing, and we're really roaming off. And I mean, we're not political analysts, but I can watch things well enough to know, hey, if it's a voting issue, even on abortion, which everybody thinks, every evangelical Christian, it's the biggest thing ever. But every time we get a chance to vote on it, abortion stands.
Mm-hmm.
It got taken away not because people, many of which who were Christians, who secretly went in and voted against what they publicly say they believe.
Mm-hmm.
Abortion, the rights to have abortion in this country, they stand.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true with this. I know the fear is that Supreme Court might rule and take away homosexual rights in that.
Mm-hmm.
If it ever comes to a vote, that will not be true.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not all Christians even.
No, that's what I mean.
That's what I keep going back to. Why do Christians? And that's a it has a feeling of you're encompassing everybody.
Yes.
We have talked about it, and there's a lot of outspoken people who talk about it. But even they have to know that the people that they are talking to or teaching or discipling are not following this, not only in the areas of homosexuality or trans issues, they're not following in the way of Jesus in heterosexual issues either.
Sure, that's right. Well, and so that may be a good, because I think we might have answered most of this, so I don't want to shift off of it, but I do want to throw this out when you say of putting more emphasis on sexual sins than others and should they be treated differently. I don't think they should be treated differently, but I will say in the scripture, Paul does make a statement about sexual sins that he doesn't make about any other
kind of sin.
And he says, all other sins happen outside the body. Don't you know that sexual sins, they happen within the body. They're happening in your body. And here's how it's not only Christians that think that sexual wrongdoing is somehow worse than or different than other wrongdoing.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, we have an entire criminal section of people that have to register because we agree. Everyone looks and goes,
there's greater damage.
There's a different kind of damage that's happening here. And anyone who's experienced sexual assault of any kind would say there's a different kind of damage that happens here than that happens even with a physical assault, which carries lots of damage as well. But it's different. And I don't know levels of severity. It's just different. And so to say, why do Christians emphasize it so much? I think we as a culture also, there's something in us humanely that understands this gift of sexuality is this precious thing. It's incredibly intimate and personal. Now, we may disagree on where do you draw a line on wrongdoing. Christians may draw the line somewhere else. But all of society seems at least to draw a line somewhere and say, when that happens, we have to deal with that. And we have to address that. And I think that's why Paul says at one point, hey, don't you know all other sins happen outside the body? But this one affects your very bodies.
Well, everybody has sexual boundaries somewhere.
Correct.
That's right.
Now, people disagree on where those are.
That's,
That's
right.
right.
But everybody says that's too far.
And
or that's-
should, just to be
and
clear,
should.
and you should have sexual
Absolutely.
boundaries.
I wasn't implying.
No,
that.
I knew you weren't. I just
But-
wanted to say that.
But we all have to be honest. Even folks who would draw their sexual parameters, boundaries, limits in different places than I personally would.
Sure.
That you have to admit you have standards somewhere on that, and I think what you alluded to earlier is because of the way that we have talked poorly about this, we have made those differences sources of deep animosity and conflict and anger, and for that I think the church owes a lot of. We ought to repent for some of that.
Oh yeah, the way
you
we've
know?
talked about it for sure.
So yeah,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean that the boundaries themselves they don't have to be that way.
Well, and
Or
my
talked about that way, I guess is what
No.
I should say.
my hope would
All sin should be talked about with the people who are involved.
yeah.
It should never be talked about in a way of, hey, here's the rule. So I don't have anything else to say. Here's the rule. So go on.
Yeah.
And that's the bad way of talking about it. And because you said this is such a intimate issue,
Mm-hmm.
one, I think the church hasn't wanted to be open to even talk about it more openly than here's the rule.
Yes.
And shut up about everything else. That's
Yes.
a bad way to talk about it. But
Yeah.
because it's so personal to people,
Mm-hmm.
people also feel like when you even talk about it in better ways, because it's so personal to me, it feels like you're saying something really bad about me, that it doesn't feel the same way when I say to people, hey, come on, all of us have done things not only the Bible standards, I can't keep my own standards.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, let's just forget. I hate when people lie to me. I lie.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There aren't humans that can say, no, I hate when people lie to me. And I have never, ever once in my life
Right.
told a lie. No,
Yeah.
nobody, everybody knows I can't. But when you say this, because it's so personal to me,
Mm-hmm.
it feels differently. And that's why it has to be talked about personally with people
Yeah.
interactively.
Sure.
It's not any different than anything else.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I think, and you brought up the sexual revolution, and I do think that's a really good point, because I think what unfortunately happened, and maybe the church standing on rules, I wasn't alive when all of that happened. I came into the world after the sexual revolution, but I think maybe the church, we don't have a vision of what sexuality looks like in a human flourishing context. We don't talk about it in that way. So all we have is what you can't do and what you should do. And honestly, when I was growing up in church, most of the sexuality talk, maybe because we were trying to live into the sexual revolution, was and once you're married, go hog wild, and anything you want to do, as long as it doesn't break this rule and this rule and this rule, do whatever you want. And what it became is we have a view of sexuality where it is primarily about pleasure, and it is primarily about self-expression, and it is not this sacred thing that too is wrapped into my life, with my interactive life with God. And honestly, saying this, even to me, I'm the one saying it, but it's uncomfortable. We don't have a view of sexuality that God would be involved in my sexual activity.
And
that feels uncomfortable
and
for
that
us to
done
say.
correctly would build human flourishing and worship toward God. That
Yes.
God would receive
That
worship.
there's a way in which this is a sacramental, sacred part of my life, and that God would be interested in my sexuality. To most of us, that sounds dirty and weird and almost like disrespectful to God. It's like God, as long as I stay in the boundaries, God almost kind of just closes his eyes and goes, you go do what you need to do. And I'm because you followed the rules and we're fine. But if you're not following the rules, I'm ready to get you. And we just don't have this view of that God created us for an interactive life where I would love and be loved, that I would be known and I would know another person, that I would be desired and I would desire, and I would pursue God and I would pursue other people and I allow people to pursue me. That all of those kind of deep, what we might call maybe transcendental kind of feelings, because honestly, if you watch movies and there's ever a sex scene or something in there, there's this euphoric, almost like worshipful way that people express themselves in this, that everyone goes, that's not what any actual act of sexuality looks like. But people have this, they're like, the music goes up and everything, and because we've turned it into this full experience, because I think there is an aspect of, you said, worship that is supposed to happen, but not worship of me.
Right. Or the other person.
Or worship of the other person.
Or the two of us.
Or the act of sexuality.
And it's really gotten out of whack when, for a lot of people in our culture, the deepest truth about me is who I'm attracted to, who I have
right.
And so that I must let you know that part of me, you can't really understand me unless you know that part of me.
Yes.
That's not the deepest part of you.
No.
Well, that's limiting the image of God within people to one thing.
Right.
And that is not what that means. The image of God is not, it is our sexuality a part of it? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
But it is not the thing, nor should it be the primary thing.
No.
It should be a complementary piece to the, others focused, sacrificial,
yes.
Enemy loving, posture of that God takes towards us. And if it does, then okay. But yeah, you're right. Too much.
Yeah, and I just think we miss it. And I think I used to say this to teenagers when I was a youth minister, of if sex is the highest good, which is often the way our culture talks about it, that if I say, hey, you can't just have sex with whoever you want to have sex with, I'm somehow oppressing you. And if I tell myself, hey, I can't just do whatever I want sex, I'm repressing myself. That's the way we talk about it. You're repressed. Oh, even the way you said it, that's repressed. You're too repressed. So sex is the highest good. Then that means Jesus never experienced the highest good of humanity. And that is antithetical to what we believe, which is that Jesus was the most human person to ever live. Jesus was the most human. He was what some theologians would call the proto-human. He is the example of this is what humanity can look like. Man or woman, if you would live a life like Jesus, you would experience the best possible life, and that includes no sex and dying on a cross. And so to look at that and say, oh, there is a way for me to experience a full and fulfilling life with God that either doesn't involve sexuality, it doesn't involve an expression of my sexuality or sexual activity, or involves this sexual activity that he has prescribed.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's not limiting and it's not repressive. It is somehow the fullness of what it means to be human. But we've missed that because we've turned it into something else.
Yep.
So the reason we've overemphasized it or talked about it in bad ways is because we too are sinful people.
Yes.
And we've wanted simple answers to uncomfortable questions. And really, the other people who ask the question and want a simple answer and not having a conversation, they're also part of the problem. If I have to give you a yes/no answer that satisfies you to a very difficult kind of situation that involves the deep parts of us, that's the reason it gets overemphasized, is we both are making it more than it is.
And as we've already said, it does not negate everything else about you as a person or a Christian in the situation, nor does sin does not negate who I am as a Christian. It's whether or not I really have my feet pointed towards Jesus and I walk, and am I open to the fact that there may be things I have to lay down or put up on the cross in order to pursue him.
Well, my job, as I have always seen it, and I had this conversation with a group of people years ago who we didn't share the same sexual ethic, but I was convinced they wanted to follow God as well. And they asked this very question, one of the first things, and I said, you're going to find things about me that quickly you will know don't align with Jesus. The deal you're talking about is just very evident up front right now. You've made it very evident. if you will and I will walk this path together with Jesus over the years and love each other and study the life of Jesus, I'm okay with him talking to you about whatever he needs to talk to you about and bring you to the place you need to be. If you will also give me the same grace and love me when I mess up, and if you want me to talk to you about what's going on in your life and how I see the Spirit at work, I'm happy to do that. But that's really a you and Jesus thing. But if you want me to tell you what the Bible says, I did study the Bible. I can tell you what the Bible says. But in the end, this is a you and Jesus thing. You and him have to walk all this stuff out together. And I'm willing to walk with you. And that's the way I have handled this with anybody who has given me a chance to have a conversation.
All right. Tough topic. Lots of nuance there. Hope it helped clear some of that up for you. As always, you can send us questions. Link is in the description, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Until next time, have a good week. See you.